One, we are ready to begin a productive afternoon session. To get us started, I would love to turn it over to Jeff to tee up where we'd like to direct our attention next.
Sure. We would like to move to 668, a second, it happened one more time, 602.24, which includes transfer of credit. We understand a lot of folks have an interest in discussing that. Our proposal here is that we spend the first half of our 90-minute block of the afternoon discussing and going through this section and getting it past us. And then we can launch into the broader discussion of the issues dealing with constitutional issues and civil rights.
I see a couple of cards. I do want to acknowledge that some of the constituencies were wanting to swap. And since we are at the top of a topic, if that is in case, let me get through a few of these. Bill, is that what we'd like to do?
Yes, I'm going to have David transfer in.
Okay, we welcome David Eubanks, primary, back to the table. Rebecca, is it a swap or is it substantive?
Yeah, swap, please.
Swap, okay, perfect. We're gonna welcome our alternate Brian back to the table. And Ryan, is this also a swap?
Yes, I'd like to swap with Magnus.
Thank you.
Time.
We will recognize primary Magnus back at the table. With those procedural matters out of the way, and as we're switching, I am going to invite the committee members to start indicating through their comment cards, comments and questions that they have around 602.24.
And this starts on page 87. With the first set of changes being at the bottom of 87 in paragraph B, there's some additional text that's added there for clarification. And then Magnus, I know on the second, on C, on the next page, you had some concerns.
Okay, great. I'm going to open it up. David, you had your card up. Do you have something?
I do if we are ready to discuss 3 on page 96, but if there's matters before that, I'm happy to wait.
I think we're going to probably start on page 88. Does that work for you? Okay.
Jeffrey, you have the floor.
Thank you. Actually, looking at that paragraph you just mentioned on page 87 about site visits that cannot be conducted solely by agency staff, can the department kind of share with us a little bit what their thinking and rationale was by expanding those that visit the campus, as this is going to create additional cost for the schools when we're sort of looking to bring that back for the schools?
To be honest, we didn't see that this would increase cost. In fact, most agencies have more than just a staff member for either a branch campus or a change of ownership. And we felt that it was a better use of having those experts that have the administrative expertise, as opposed to just leaving it up to staff to make those determinations, to make those evaluations, I'm sorry.
So you're thinking that more than someone from the agency would go out and do the visit, or would it be, because typically they bring someone from another school?
Right. No, that's what I'm talking about, is that instead of it just being a staff member from an agency to go and conduct this type of evaluation, it would include a volunteer of some sort going with them.
Sure. No, I understand that part. There just would be additional costs that would get passed on to the school for that, for their travel, et cetera.
I mean, it could be, but I would say that for these specific types of visits, it's usual that they have more than one person anyway. It's just codifying current practice by most of the agencies.
Okay.
Jeff, did you want to speak on that as well?
Yeah, no, I don't think we're looking at a net increase in the number of staff that would go. It would be substitutions of the what those members were comprised of. So you would have, if the agency was sending 2 staff, you'd have 1 agency staff and an outside volunteer.
I see no additional cards at this time. Are we ready to move on in this section? Jennifer?
Just one quick comment. So Beth, this is the place where I think it's the top of 89 where we would add in that pre-accredit, like if they lose, or is this where you were thinking the applicability of pre-accreditation loss and teach out plans and agreements?
Yeah, you brought up that change. I'm going to have to look to see exactly
Okay.
where the best place to put that in, but it would be in 60224C somewhere, but it would be moving some of that language that you have.
Okay.
I've got that noted.
Okay, great. Thanks.
Thank you, Jennifer. Thank you, Beth. Magnus, you have the floor.
I just want to. I don't want to skip ahead for the department, so I'm on page 90. I know Jennifer was just on page 89, so just want to make sure we're ready to move there. If
Yeah, I was actually on page 88, but if you guys are past 88, we can go to 89.
okay, so in this section, Romanet, I'm looking at Romanet 3 under section 3, which was added by the department. It says the department may require institution to provide financial protections in relation to a teach out plan. This is another area where I'm going to ask about must or will require the institution to provide financial protection for students in these cases. And wondering A, how open you are to that, or B, if that is statutorily, you're able to do that. Please let me know if I've made you lost.
Sorry, just looking at the stem and going back and forth on this one.
I think the use of the may, it was not to tie the department's hands to require it, but in fact required if necessary. I'm just going to leave it like that. I'm not an FSA expert, so.
Generally speaking, the HEA allows the department to require financial guarantees of institutions where such certain conditions are met. I don't have them off the top of my head, but there are a list of enumerated situations in which you couldn't require them. Most institutions that are going to go through a teach out plan or are looking at one are probably under those situations anyways. But it's may, because the secretary has discretion there may be cases where financial protection isn't warranted for whatever reason. However, like I said, if it's necessary to protect the financial interest of the United States taxpayers or to basically, stave off the potential for liabilities, we are allowed to require financial guarantees.
Okay, yeah. So this is an area where, of course, a lot of student assistance monies come from taxpayer-funded programs like the Pell Grant and subsidized loans and things like that. So I know you said you don't have those requirements in front of you. If the department in a little while would be able to provide those, just as a student, as a layman, would be able to understand that. Because, of course, this is a consumer protection for students here. I would also like to suggest in that section, I know I'm probably running out of time, though, so happy to go back in the queue.
I want to touch on that real quick, if you don't mind.
Sure.
It's not protection for students if the institution shuts down. Those financial guarantees protect the department, not students. Students may receive closed school loan discharges or something else. While institutions have to pay that to the department, in theory, liabilities, they don't always make us whole. That's why we request the financial guarantees. It's to ensure us, not students. Students are protected by the department. And any closed school loan discharges and whatnot are not paid out by the institution directly to students.
I see. Thank you.
Thank you, Magnus. I'll put you back in the queue. Next, I'm going to Michael, who may take us back a page or two. Michael, will you direct us to where you'd like us to review?
88. Romanet 2. C2, or take any other formal action against the institution related to its financial condition. So that opens up the prospect of requiring a teach out plan for pretty much anything. We might place an institution on financial reporting because the department has them on HCM1, and that's purely monitoring. But that is a formal action unless you have some other thing that you have in mind there. But formal action from an accrediting agency perspective is any time I put my signature on a letter is a formal action of some sort. So I would highly, I don't know what you're trying, the department is trying to necessarily achieve through this. So maybe either a more definitive term, a more definitive action, or striking that proposed language from Romanet 2 due to its broadness.
Thank you, Michael. Next, Jennifer, I'd like to give you the floor.
I'm going back to 90, so I guess, is that all right? Okay. So with regard to Magnus's comments, I actually had the same question about may versus must on that sub-Romanet 3, and I do understand that in most situations, if you're at the teach out agreement phase, you already have a letter of credit or some form of financial protection, probably. I would, as a solution, I would consider I would ask the department to consider changing the may to must, but adding at the end if such financial protection already does not exist or something like that. So that if there has been if for whatever reason, all of a sudden a school's in the position of a teach out agreement, which to me feels like a sudden closure, or not a sudden closure, but something precipitous, that we have that we would want the department to be imposing. So I understand, Jake, what you're saying about giving the discretion to the secretary, but I feel like in this situation, if there's not already a letter of credit or other financial protection, that it kind of should be a must. So I'm thinking must if the department hasn't already done so. Something like that. I think that was it. I think I had another thought, but that's good enough for now.
Thank you, Jennifer. Magnus, I'm back to you.
Oh, wow. Okay. So back to page 90. So we were looking at Romanet 3 there. I'm looking at the idea of adding a Romanet 4 to say something to the effect that the agency will work with the department and appropriate state agencies to the extent feasible to assist students in finding reasonable opportunities to complete their education without additional charges.
If you're jumping ahead of us a little bit, is that I believe that would be covered under section D under closed institution. We added some requirements as to what the accrediting agency is supposed to do if an institution were to close without without any teach out plan or agreement in C.
Thank you for that, but I don't see any specific thing about working with students or assisting students to complete their education without additional charges. If I'm missing that, can you help me hone in on it?
I don't think it has that specific language, but I believe it's implied by working with institutions identified in the teach out plan to secure transfer options with those institutions, to making teach out or transfer options, the terms, information on obtaining transcripts, loan discharges, reimbursement publicly available, working with states, and working to secure the teach out agreements, which would directly impact the students who are listed in those agreements.
Jeff, did you want to add to that?
Let's just say, by definition, a teach out doesn't result in additional cost for the student because they've already paid. And so you're finding another institution to provide it. And then this particular section is dealing with the situation of an institution that cannot find another institution on their teach out. So there isn't, I said, again, by definition, a teach out, there isn't a cost there.
Jake?
I actually want to go briefly back to Jennifer's point, and Magnus, I can respond to your other question about financial responsibility too. So that's all set forth in section 498 of the HEA. The reason it has to be may is we can't request financial guarantees from institutions if they meet the financial responsibility standards. Now, it is feasibly possible that an institution could be shutting down and meet the financial responsibility standards under the statute. So it's unlikely to be the case. In most cases, they're going to have provided a letter of credit under the financial responsibility guidelines, which are and the regulations set forth in 668. However, because there is that narrow possibility, we have to write it as may.
Okay. Magnus, did you have any very brief follow-up? And then I'll do the same with you, Jennifer.
Not on this specific issue, but back in the queue for others.
Thank you so much, Jennifer.
So, yeah, you reminded me about the lovely financial composite score requirements, which can be really arbitrary, but that's okay. It's a whole nother rulemaking. However, there are situations other than financial composite score where you do place, like, for example, change of controls, you put letters of credit. So just food for thought that there is some, to your point about secretarial discretion, I think you do have discretion. I'm just trying to, I mean, this seems like an important issue for students. I am always sympathetic. If you have a school that can't even get a teach out plan, like, I think you want, and it's not, this isn't, because I agree with Jake, the dollars don't go to the students, but it's a protection against the taxpayer, and actually a taxpayer issue. It's protection against the taxpayer dollars. So I just think that it should be something that you could think about in the discretion, because I know the secretary does have discretion on letters of credit.
Thank you, Jennifer. Michael, you have the floor.
Well, just a quick follow-up on that. I certainly do not oppose the department being able to do that may, must, should, will, shall, whatever. But I don't know why or how, under the regulation for additional procedures certain institutional agencies must have, we're writing a regulation giving the department authority to do something. So it seems to me that if this is something that you want accreditors to monitor and align to, that would be a better fit for this section. So it might be something like, and monitor whether the department has required the institution to provide financial protection and to, take that into consideration in making its decision, or something along those lines, as opposed to, it doesn't tell accreditors to do anything or to add an additional procedure.
Now that's a good catch, Mike. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you, Jeff. Raymond, you have the floor.
Thank you. And I'm asking this on behalf of my colleague, Chancellor Duffy, who has an interest in teach out in particular. On page 90, number 3, where it says the department may require the institution to provide financial protection. Does the financial protection, would that also include items like ensuring transcripts are maintained so that the students would have an ability to continue their education? In private conversations, he has discussed with me, there are occasions where, particularly with smaller private schools who have gone under, they've spent their endowment down, they've gone to the point where they can't make payroll, and then they just abruptly close the doors. And so you've got a whole generation of students at those institutions who possibly could be, they're already in a bad position because their institution's closed, but if they've closed down and there's no protection in terms of protecting their transcripts and ensuring they can continue on, they're in a really bad position. The question is, would this include those types of protections, or do you envision those types of protections are included somewhere else?
And so the teach out agreements contain, address those elements, and I believe those are in D.
I'm sorry, I'm going to clarify. So in D is the closed institution, like if you're talking about a precipitous closure, and that's what it would talk about, the transfer, transcripts and things like that. In C, the teach out plans and agreements would require them to have the enrolled students, and those institutions that take over that are involved in the teach out agreement would then take on the responsibility of transcripts and the things that you mentioned.
Thank you, Jeff. Thank you, Beth. Raymond, do you have any brief follow-up?
One last observation. If they have bankrupted themselves, having a plan is great, but the plan is useless if it can't be executed.
Thank you.
Sorry. As Beth noted, the precipitous closure has a whole different set of procedures there. If they do it sort of on their way down, for example, and they execute the agreement deals with the transfer of records and as Beth pointed out, they're actually transferring into the new institution.
Thank you, Raymond. Thank you, Jeff. Magnus, you have the floor.
Thank you. So I am, let me find my spot here. I'm looking at, I think it is page 92, the end of 92, what used to be 7 and is now 8. So first things first, I've lost my spot now. I apologize, just a moment. Maybe you can help me find it. There's a point in here where teach out plan is stricken and added in is teach out agreement. And I seem to have lost that, and that's what I have a question about.
Page 91.
Thank you so much. So so that's paragraph 5. I just wanted to applaud the department for putting in teach out agreement there, or that may not be the one that I'm thinking about, because I think teach out plan.
I think you want 2. So what we did is in 2, which is on, unfortunately, I think my pagination is off. I'm sorry, number page 91.
91. Let's see. Yes, thank you. Wait, 91, 2.
Number 2.
There's no 2 on 91.
Oh.
I see 5,
I'm
6,
sorry, I must have the wrong page.
89. Okay, well,
Yeah.
The point is that an agreement is stronger than a plan, because an agreement is something that is signed, it's official, whereas a plan is just like, here's what we plan to do. So that's great. I realize we take up a lot of time with that, so I'm happy to go back in the queue.
I'm happy to hear one more, please.
Okay. So on page 92 then, with what will now become paragraph 8, the department has stricken the end of that by ensuring that the teach out institution and then Romanets 1, 2, 3, and 3A, B have been stricken there. So I'm wondering why the department feels that while requiring a teach out agreement shouldn't demonstrate that it has the resources and experience to offer it, and why it shouldn't be required to demonstrate that it has the capacity to carry out its obligation in that sense, in that instance.
Yeah, no, so this was done to give more ability for the agency to implement the teach out agreement as they saw fit, as opposed to having prescriptive regulations to require exactly what they should include.
Okay, I would advocate for adding those back in, and then if the department feels that it needs to be a little bit more broad, have those as things that are specific, and then add additional language that broadens that to the department's discretion, because I feel that those are very explicit protections that relate to students. So I think all of that should be added back in, Romanets 1 through 3 in their subsections.
Thank you, Magnus. Raymond, I am back to you. Good. Michael, you have the floor.
Sticking on that point. When we developed this language in 2019, the if practicable on page 89, the discussion was around the fact that if an institution is placed on HCM 1, it's not practical to require a teach out agreement at that point. That's a signed agreement with another institution to say, we'll teach out your students, and it's very, intensive and it's difficult to achieve. There are, I don't know how many schools are on HCM1, but it's a lot as a percentage. So either, and the other is Romanet 4, when they intend to just voluntarily close, they may be teaching out their own students. And so there would be no need for a teach out agreement there. So what I'm suggesting either is to keep the language in paragraph 2 and continue to discern that there are different times when you need a teach out plan and additional times when you need a teach out agreement, or to be more clear about that and say, here's when we definitely want a teach out plan, and here's where we definitely want a teach out agreement. And the agreement would probably come under reimbursement payment, emergency action to LS&T, withdrawal or termination, or loss of state licensure authority. The other ones, I think, again, HCM1 and voluntary closure with a planned runway teach out would be more of just a teach out plan.
Thank you, Michael. Jennifer, you have the floor.
I think I was pretty much about to echo what Michael said, and having been involved in voluntary closures, distinguishing the types of teach outs are really important. And also having been involved with HCM1 for a long time, I just don't want to require too much out of going to Magnus's, because I think his point was slightly different. I would just urge, this is another example of balancing, because I know, Magnus, that you're probably interested, well, not probably, you are interested in protecting the students and making sure that the agreements, are sort of viable, if you will. But time is sort of also of the essence when you're dealing in a teach out situation, or depending on the teach out. So I think getting caught up in like the review process of whether or not the plan or it's really the agreement is has all of this level of detail in it is something that's actually going to hurt the student, because you need the plans and you need the agreements quickly. So it's like a race to get it done in a way to protect the student. Because what I have found in a closure, even in a voluntary closure, is that it takes time. Forget just these criteria. It takes time to negotiate the agreements. And one of the things we've seen is students, even in a voluntary closure, the minute you say that you're closing, the students, even if you don't want them to flee, they start fleeing, even if you have a really good agreement in place for the students. And so I think you just want to be careful about getting in the way of the better good, which is to have the agreements at all. It's much harder for students to get in the door at institutions where there's no agreement in place. And I sometimes feel like, and I did this 3 times, so sadly. So I've seen it, and it was frustrating to really get good teach out agreements in place, but the students weren't relying on those teach out agreements, but then they would come back and say, well, I can't transfer. And it's like, well, we have this agreement. So I just keep that in mind, that I think you don't want to get too burdened by the structure of the agreements. I also, by the way, think that should be left between there's an academic piece of this, not dissimilar from transfer of credit, where the discretion should be between the 2 schools on some of the issues and not with department regulation.
Thank you, Jennifer. Julie, you have the floor.
Thank you. I'm just going to say that with respect to the department wanting to make this not a burdensome process for the agencies, we've seen it time and time again, student veterans getting wrapped up in school closures and all of this. And my initial thought, and with respect to the conversation happening, I think as many protections as we can put in place without making it an overly burdensome process for institutions. But I see that a lot of the language has shifted over to the closed institution section under D. And I just think if, where possible, we should have as many protections for students caught up in the falling dominoes of one school after another. I just want to make sure, and maybe that exists somewhere else and I'm just unfamiliar with it. Maybe that's in the designation of what a teach out is, but I'm just going to reiterate that as many protections for the student without being overly burdensome. Or if the students are the ones caught in the crosshairs, then maybe it needs to be burdensome.
Thank you, Julie. Magnus, you have the floor.
Yeah, appreciate you saying that, Julie, and Jennifer. Appreciate you speaking to my point there. And forgive me if it went over my head, but so you mentioned that this is an example of an area where we need balance, and you sort of described that process and the timeliness. But after saying balance, I didn't hear any suggestions or examples of how student protections are still in place during those speedy processes. So in the interest of balance, do you have any suggestions in your expertise where we can strike a balance between the protections that I feel are quite necessary for students in those instances that would still allow for adequate speediness in putting these agreements together?
Jennifer, would you like to respond?
Yeah. So I think my feeling on this section is that, and Michael has more experience in this regard, both with regard to closures, but also with regard to, because he was at the table when a lot of them were written. But my feeling is that this is pretty robust. But there's also, I believe, another section in the law that is the institutional requirements around. There's a complementary section in the regs on teach out. So it's not just here. These are the accreditation requirements around the teach out plan processes. There's another section that where the institution needs to be complying. And then the final thing I'll say is that I do feel like the department, so I'll talk about the triad. So I'll talk about, but just from a federal standpoint, there is federal oversight with regard, as you well know, with regard to the borrower defense and other claims. And then finally, the states. So I do think that there are belts and suspenders as it relates to state closures. I know it's not perfect, and I know that Ohio has dealt with this, and many states have. But I personally, I think that we're good. Closures are complicated, so we're never going to get to good on a closure.
Jeff, did you want to speak on this as well?
Not on this. I wanted to see if we could bring this to closure on the teach out plans, because we still do have a lot more to discuss. And I know transfer of credit is going to take up a lot of bandwidth. So I think we've heard we've heard pretty loud and clear some of the issues around teach out plans, and we'll go back and take a look on both ends in terms of that balance. And I'd like to see if we can move to closed institution on D.
There are a couple more cards up, so I'm going to continue working through those. Magnus, I'm ready to move on unless you had very brief follow-up in response.
I did just have very brief follow-up. Just thanks, Jennifer. And as Julie said, students are nowhere near experts on this. So if this does exist elsewhere in the regulations, whether it's within the accreditation portion or another, happy to learn more about that. Thank you so much.
Michael, you have the floor.
Let's talk about D, closed institutions. If that works for you, Jeff.
Good man, Mike.
Works for me, Mike.
My question is really kind of the defining characteristic of a precipitous closure is the fact that it closes without a teach out plan or agreement. And so by striking it here, you're requiring everything below it for any institution that closes. So having the without a teach out plan or agreement was purposeful to really address the precipitous closure issue, and that in those instances, those are the times you want to be, working through those things. So I just wanted to point that out, that I think you've put us in a position to have to really do this for every institution, even if they are closing responsibly. And if I could just also quickly add for Raymond and Mike, there is a requirement for a record retention plan in the accreditation standards that does deal with things like transcripts and things of that nature. It's just that accreditors don't have a mechanism to really enforce any of that. We ask for it as part of the teach out plan agreement. So we won't approve it unless we see that they have taken steps. To your point about, hey, they're already in bankruptcy, there's no money for this, that's not going to happen. That comes under this closed institution bit, but usually through a responsible closure and teach out, we are asking for that information.
Thank you, Michael. Mike, I'm going to move down to you.
And this might be a good segue into the transfer conversation, but I just want to congratulate the department for paying attention to the transfer issue when looking at the teach-out plans, especially in Section D, Romanet 2, where it talks about teach-out plans and transfer. I mean, this is an area where when an institution closes precipitously, students who are part of this teach-out plan can lose a lot of ground towards their degrees. And so this is a really important area, and it's one where, to the extent we can encourage accreditors to really embrace it and think about creative ways of addressing that when these things happen, especially if it's precipitous, it's a really important aspect for those students whose lives are affected.
Yeah, no, I agree 100%, Mike. And actually, this is one I think where, as we're working through this, everybody needs to be thinking sort of beyond the edge of their box and what they can do, because it does have a real negative impact on students. And I think some of this, with some careful planning ahead of time, we could avoid a lot of the misery.
Thank you, Mike. Michael, I'm back to you. Siri, I'm over to you.
Thank you. So just for the record, based on this discussion that we've had so far today, and probably a lot of us read the news this past week, Huron Consulting Group released a report showing that 1 in 4 private nonprofits is going to close or merge in the next 10 years. Inside Higher Ed had a good article about a school we knew was going to close in the fall, but is indeed shutting its doors. All of this indicates that there should be some support for better corporate governance. Higher education institutions fail like businesses, but sometimes they lack the disclosure, fiduciary, and stakeholder protection standards that business law would demand. I think colleges are, it's a fiction that they're purely mission-driven nonprofits that are exempt from corporate governance norms. And that's produced by the asymmetric information, the captured overseers, and the students who absorb the full cost of this institutional failure. So I think the discussion so far today has really made the case for robust corporate governance standards, including independent boards, outcome floor triggers, and prospective teach-out planning. That's it.
Thank you, Siri. What additional comments or clarifying questions do we have in this section? Jennifer.
We're on transfer, right?
Sure. If you want to be there, we're there.
I mean, I wasn't planning on going first. I'm sure other people have comments. So this is an issue that I've been really involved about for very many years on transfer of credit back in the day. There actually, I know people, and it's still a problem, so I'm not going to try to say it's not. We actually have made there is progress in transfer of credit. So there has been progress. So I do want to say that it is better than it used to be. So if you think it's bad now, you should have been here 20 years ago because it was worse. I think this is an area where I keep using the word balance, but we do need to balance the interests of the students and taxpayers. Students first, which is incredibly important that they not have to redo and, perfectly good courses that they may have taken, et cetera. On the other hand, and I know we're going to have a big conversation about academic freedom, but this actually is a place where the academic determination is something that is sort of a fixture, shall we say, in academia, for better, and maybe people will say for better or for worse, but it is something where the comparative process is something that the institutions are the ones that make that decision making. So my primary concern, I think, with how this is written is with the presumption. It's not, I love that you're doing something on this. And I think that we can get there on agreement. It's the presumption that the credit transfers. I don't actually think that is good for the student. I actually think that that's dangerous for a student. So I don't love the word presumption. I have not worked up new language, but I just wanted to put out there what my general concern is.
And I'll address it quickly from the goal and the objective perspective. As you quite accurately pointed out, we are in a better place. This used to be much worse. But now we believe it's time to push a little harder because we're still not, we're not there. And I think everyone understands from the department's perspective, the amount of Title IV aid that goes to paying for courses that students have already taken elsewhere at other institutions, by and large. I think everyone understands. I think even Monty had pointed out earlier in the week the potential impact it can have on time to degree and the likelihood that a student may drop out, which is, I think, something that we don't, that none of us want. And so you guys know, I mean, we've signaled where we want to go. That is our presumption. We want to push. At the same time, we think that there's some, that there can be some discretion. We think that the onus is on the receiving institution as to why those credits can't transfer. So that's the notion here.
Thank you, Jennifer. Thank you, Jeff. Monty, you have the floor.
Thank you. This is quite the issue, I think, for all of higher education. Let's take this step back a bit to the broader perspective of the public. 1974, 2 out of 3 American working age individuals were in households that were considered middle class. Fast forward to 2024, that number was 49%. If, as is proposed by a number of us around the table, the baccalaureate degree is the standard for the middle class, transfer should be a wide open door to allow more Americans access at the local level at a community college to transfer to a university and finish the baccalaureate degree to reach the middle class. So this is a much bigger issue than simply transfer of credit or academic freedom. This is an issue of the American public. So the proposal that I would put forward, I appreciate what the department has done here. And Jennifer, you are absolutely right. We're in a better place today than we've ever been. There's no question. Having negotiated a number of these agreements with institutions that historically did not pursue transfer students, to include the University of Virginia, William & Mary, Virginia Tech. These are institutions that at the time around the turn of the century, we didn't see a lot of transfer. What we had to do was be very specific about the point that you just made. It is the role of the receiving institution to express to the student that is transferring the credits that will transfer and apply to a given degree. The challenge that I have with some of the language here is it doesn't reference degree credit, which I think is really, really important. The second point that I would make here is there should be metrics that give some sense, and this may fit more in the student outcome section, of the credits completed per baccalaureate degree completer. What I've learned in my own state is that more than 1 in 4 of the courses that were completed by individuals that were that were degree credit courses, so this is not developmental, did not apply in completion of the baccalaureate degree. So what you're saying is there's a 25% premium increase for the student that started at the local level in an effort to save money. And what are we doing but multiplying the cost because of, under the guise of, academic freedom? The proposal that I would have for you is very simple. These students need to know at the time of enrollment. Time of enrollment is a critical decision point. Why would we have individuals come to the college or come to the university, get there, 30 seconds left, and not have the ability to know on the front end what the time and the cost is? Thank you.
7 seconds to spare, Monty. Good job. That was excellent. David, you have the floor.
Yes, thank you. I appreciate the comments so far, and I think we can all agree that this is an important issue for students across the board. And Monty, I would go one further and say it's even before enrollment. It's at application. How do you know if you want to go if you don't know how many credits you're going to get, right? So I have some clarifying questions just to make sure I understand the intention, because it's a complicated problem, and what we got, in a limited amount of text seems like a kind of simple solution to a very complicated problem. And as Jennifer said, we're going to be balancing harms or risks, at least in different ways. So my first question is the assumption behind this that the credits from one school will do the same amount of work at another school as if they had taken it at that school? It seems like there is an equivalency philosophical principle behind this, that no matter where the credit is coming from, it will do the same job at its location. That would justify this. So let me start with that question.
I think where we're coming from on that is that the receiving institution should be as flexible as possible in terms of looking at those and whether or not they can meet the minimal requirements for the degree in which they're being transferred in. And you have a number of institutions out there that I think, Arizona State, University of Phoenix, that have really done a good job, I think, in terms of showing the rest of the industry that can be viable, and you can still have high quality degrees, coming out of that. So I think that, bending over backwards, I guess, is sort of my thought. Any way that you can to try to fit that in, but particularly, and I think the particular focus from our perspective is on a lot of the introductory courses at the undergraduate level. There doesn't seem to be a lot of justification in some of the cases that we have seen, and I would just hate for us to, if we didn't do something here, for us to have to look at more drastic ways to push the needle, like not paying for allowing student aid to pay for courses that are being repeated. I don't want to have to go that route, but I don't know any other way that we can really push institutions to not make people basically sit and pay for the same course twice.
Thank you. And you may recall yesterday when we talked about student achievement that one of the three prongs to improving student achievement that I proposed was better matching. That is, if the student finds the right destination for their ability and for their price, which would include 2 years of community college, perhaps before transferring, that is, I think, a very powerful way to get to student achievement. The complication here for many of the schools that are like mine is that the box plots we saw the first day were very compelling evidence that there is a lack of reliability, if you will, and the reliable authority that all institutions are producing the quality that the accreditation standards are intended to ensure. And that is very compelling that they are not. So the risk that I'm highlighting here is that I don't think the assumption that credits from one school can be thought of as equivalent just because there's some sort of nominal description, that there is in fact a great variety, and that in some cases there will be problems created that are greater than the problems we're trying to solve. And so figuring out exactly where that line is, I think, is maybe where our work is. And I guess
May I circle back?
sorry, yeah.
It's okay. Thank you. Magnus, you have the floor.
Yeah, thank you. I wanted to make a few sort of broad comments here. Starting with something that Jennifer said is we need to strike a balance between student protections and taxpayer protection, with leaning towards students. I would just assert for the purposes of thorough thought and discussion that students are taxpayers. I currently work the traditional model of a student who goes to school full time and does not have a job or just works 5 hours a week at the coffee shop is not the case anymore. So the term traditional student is has probably been outdated for 20 years now or more, at least after the financial crisis of 2008, 2009. So students are taxpayers. So any protection for students is a protection for taxpayers, in my opinion. Sorry, Michael. And then with regard to something that Jeff mentioned earlier, at the bachelor's level, I do think credits should be largely transferable between institutions generally, because they're not maybe as, at least at the 1 and 200 level for sure, the general education requirements are not as highly specialized at maybe the 200 or 300 level in the baccalaureate field, or as we move into a master's or a doctoral program. However, to something that Monty spoke on, I don't know if this is an area, because as a student, I want a quality education. So I do want to recognize that not every credit earned at one institution that may be significantly underperforming is the same as a credit at a well-performing, well-regarded institution. So I don't know if this is an area where we should really blow open the floodgates, but I would like to see that door opened a bit more. And I want to recognize the concerns that David just brought up as well, because I think I'm somewhere, maybe I'm being a fence sitter, but I'm somewhere in between where Monty and David are landing on this.
Thank you, Magnus. I'm going to acknowledge that almost every card at the table is up. So I'm going to thank you all for your continued patience as I do work around. And I will be adhering to the time limit so we can keep this moving in an orderly fashion. Julie, you have the floor.
Thank you. I will echo many, many sentiments here. In the sake of transferability, I do want to point out that not all credits are created equal. Whether they were accredited at varying levels or whatever else, let's just say that the English course I took at culinary school that I was told would transfer to a community college, I had no business transferring that credit to even a community college because it would have set me up for failure. So I do think it's important to acknowledge that, you know, if you have a returning student or a non-traditional student who has maybe done some credits elsewhere, there's some time has gone by, maybe it was a sub-delivered program or course or whatever else, just in the sake of fairness and student protection without making people, you know, repeat a class 5 times, but with the understanding that not all courses are created equal. And I would hate to see, for the sake of easing the discussion around transferability, that we might set students up for failure because they didn't know any better, that, you know, that class they took wasn't up to snuff when it came to the next level. So I just wanted to put that out there. Thanks.
Thank you, Julie. Next up, Mark, you have the floor.
Thank you. I'm going to preface this by saying that it's a hugely important issue. Appreciate the department taking it on. And I myself started in a community college, managed to transfer and graduate in 4 years on a traditional schedule, even while being a transfer student. That said, also have experience even within a state system where the transfer experiences, and this goes to Julie's point, are not equal. I have one community college where students could transfer in with high GPAs in the same courses as another institution and not thrive. And those students were set up for failure because they had enrolled in an institution that was not preparing them for transfer. Whereas other institutions, when we took students from there with the same GPAs, they not only were able to thrive, but they graduated on schedule with students who had started at the 4-year institution. So with the fear of opening up a can of worms, the onus on the accreditors is to identify institutions that are transferring students out who are set up to fail. And, you know, I don't know how we do this, but I think we do need and let me back up one thing real quick, is most transfer takes place between known partners. There's very clear pathways that lots of students follow from community colleges and particularly in institutions. So there's got to be a way to identify in advance for students before they enroll and start paying for courses, whether or not the likelihood of transfer is high. And I think that we got to get our hands around that, even though I don't want to invite lots more work. That's the only way to do this, I think.
Thank you, Mark. Michael, you have the floor.
Thank you. And Mark, thank you for sharing that. And I think probably many people around the table have similar know somebody or themselves have had some kind of experience. I also a transfer student from a community college to a university where I was then promptly told I couldn't enroll in the education school because I was a community college student and that I was not academically prepared for UVA's ed school. So I decided I would just go back and get my doctorate a few years later from them. But that is the issue on presumption swings both ways. And you know what they say about assumption. So this is an incredibly important topic. I want to echo also, Jennifer, we have come a long way. Organizations like ACRO and ACE and CHIA and the Learn Commission, those things, are moving this along. And even though the recommendations that have been coming out of those organizations for a relatively long period of time really pushing on the issue of responsible, fair, transparent, and equitable transfer of credit decisions, the institutions themselves have been the resistant parties. And so, under the guise of the same, your credits are not as good as our credits. They can't possibly be. And so that has been really detrimental for students. The additional layer on that is not just, and I don't use the term traditional education because I work in what I think is really traditional education, and that's in vocational and career-oriented fields that were around a long time before colleges were. And so, the idea what our students are challenged with are the opportunities to go from a non-degree program into a degree program, or even to take, they went to a career or vo-tech school and can't take those credits to a university. And so again, there's much to be done at the institutional level, and I think accreditors have the opportunity to really set forth that expectation with their institutions that we are here for students, and this is a student-centered process, and we need to find ways to make student educational access portable because that is the reality and has been for quite some time. So the language here is a very useful first start. As you might imagine, I would say it could use a tweak or two or seven, and we'll certainly work on those. I don't think that it's just general education or electives that we need to be talking about. There are major-oriented courses, or I'm done. Thank you.
Red light. Jeff, please.
Yeah, you are exactly correct that this is an institutional issue. And as I said, we want to move the ball forward. We think that doing this through the accreditation route gives us probably a better potential result. Because when I look in our toolbox at the department, I got a lot of sledgehammers and other tools that may not be as elegant as what you guys can perform on the accreditation side. So yeah, we don't have a lot of levers here, but we do need to move it. And so again, we are asking you to help us to improve this problem, so we don't have to use some of our tools that may not perform as well.
Can I just point out that Jeff used elegant and accreditation in the same sentence? So thank you for that.
It's in the record twice now.
The record.
All right. Raymond, thank you for your patience. You have the floor.
Thank you. I have seen studies that show the number one reason why transfer students fail to complete is because their credits don't transfer. And they get frustrated that they're going to have to take classes twice, and many of them just turn away and stop. I've also seen studies that show up to 30% of credits fail to transfer, up to 30%. And we all know that this impacts graduation rate. Currently, 35% of people who enroll will stop out and not complete. A significant portion of them are transfer students who got frustrated for this reason. So I commend the department for raising this issue. I think it's critically important, and I agree with the points that have been made. And like Mark and Michael, I started in a community college, transferred to a private liberal arts college, and got my master's at a public university. So I've made the tour myself, and I've been blessed in that all of my credits transferred no matter where I was going. And I do see that as a blessing, because if my credits had not transferred, I could have easily been one of those statistics that just said, this isn't worth it, and walked away. In Florida, our transfer students largely come from our Florida college system, overwhelmingly. So in our state, we took our two systems together. Legislature required us to do this, and we created common course numbering for the general education 1,000, 2,000 level series. Now, if you get a C in that course, regardless of where you are in Florida, it will transfer from the Florida college system to the university system, or if you wanted to go the other way, vice versa. That has had a significant impact on the success of our students. We know that our data shows that more of our transfer students graduate than our competitors, and I'm talking about other states. And we know that our students who transfer in graduate, their time to completion is faster than in other states because we have done this. So I think it's a worthwhile exercise. I'm always very cautious when I hear autonomy or academic freedom. And the reason I'm cautious is when I hear autonomy, it's usually coming from a university who's been asked to do something they don't want to do. And when I hear academic freedom, most often the context is from a faculty member that's been asked to do something they don't want to do. So anytime I hear those, my hackles go up, and I'm very cautious. And I'm going to say a quiet part out loud, because I've heard this discussed elsewhere and outside of this area when I've been in conferences. One of the reasons institutions don't want to accept the credit is they want that student to take that course at their institution because they want the money. This shouldn't be about the money. This should be about the students. And I think that's what you're doing here. Thank you.
Thank you, Raymond. Jennifer, you have the floor.
Yeah, thanks, Raymond. I think we all have these sort of horror stories. I wanted to just move things like sort of into a constructive recommendation mode. There are just a couple I've been taking notes. I'm sure you have been too, but taking notes on thoughts. And I think I wanted to echo, I think it was Monty, but the time of acceptance is where I do think timing actually is something to consider in regulation, that decisions, an institutional decision around whether they're going to accept or deny credits needs to occur at the time of acceptance rather than time of enrollment. That's too late. And so I do think actually encouraging in some way time would be a really good add. I would break up in 3. I would break it in 2 because I am more sympathetic. I'm sympathetic all the way around. Like I said before, I'm passionate about this issue, but the gen ed piece, I want to think about what the language looked like, but if like the presumption piece is super important to the department, the presumption piece around gen ed would be something I could grasp more than I can around a field of study. So you could break the sections up where there's more institutional discretion. And then I did have an addition that hasn't been brought up. It says, when you're asking for the rationale, it says that it's specific to the course completed by the student. One of the reasons, and I don't want to belabor this or make it into a bigger deal, but there are 2 issues that go into the decision of acceptance. It's the quality of the course and the comparativeness. There's also the performance of the student in that course. So I don't want to lose sight of that. So I just would say, like, that they probably, if that's a reason for denial, that also needs to be stated rather than just the quality of the course, because that does happen. And my final point is that a couple of people now have raised articulation agreements, whether it's between college and I don't know what is, but I think the more we can encourage our existing agreements to exist. So I don't know what that looks like in regulation, but I always would encourage institutions to be having articulation agreements however possible. So those are just some thoughts.
Thank you, Jennifer. Jeff, did you want to speak on any of that?
Yeah, and just quickly, I just want to end this because your point is very similar to the point that Julie raised. We're not, if a student chooses not to transfer those in, this is not saying that they would have to. And we acknowledge that that is a possibility either because of the passage of time or because of the grade they received, or maybe because of the type of institution they thought they were, that they were coming from, that they were dissatisfied with that. So this is not forcing that, but basically the presumption here is that if a student wants to transfer their credits in, that they have, that they should be allowed to do it to the maximum extent possible.
Brief follow-up, Jennifer. Microphone, please.
Not to speak for Julie, but I think what she was trying to say is that there may have been reasons for the institution to deny those credits based on time. And I actually do think that that's a good point. If somebody took a gen ed class, even a gen ed class 10 years earlier, times do change in curriculum. And so that would be a legit reason for denying. So you could put that into your list of reasons for denial.
Thank you, Jennifer. David, thank you for your patience. You have the floor.
Yes, thank you. So I started a minute ago with a dissertation on variability. I apologize if I got too long. But one of the points of that, we had great data presentation. It is possible, I believe, to do a similar data presentation if you can get cooperation from the National Student Clearinghouse to actually analyze the scope of the problem in vast detail. And if we imagine that through this process, for example, just the timing issue were fixed so that in kind of a free market model, students can now apply to 5 or 6 institutions like they do now and get back, oh, here's my best offer, including transfer credits, then that undoubtedly would improve the situation. And you could measure that again with a discontinuity analysis on the National Student Clearinghouse, and we could all celebrate that. Extending that time idea, Raymond, I think, was mentioning the state system, but those state system constructions of things take time to build because it's intricate and complicated. I'm sure the governor just didn't issue an executive order one day and said, you all have to accept each other's transfer credits, right? That would have been chaos. So I think when I'm looking at the red line here, it seems like the kind of thing that would be in an accreditation standard where me as a peer reviewer, I would get some documents relevant to this and I could make some judgment about whether or not they're complying with the spirit of this thing or whether they should get a citation, follow up and all that stuff. And that would, back to the time theme, allow institutions to change in appropriate ways as guided by an accreditor. So my question for the department, I guess, is why isn't this just an accreditation standard that has kind of the typical philosophical language that we would expect to be adjudicated?
Jeff?
Yeah, well, it's a standard, but it's a standard that's not in statute. So we can't create new standards. So we're trying to keep it within the appropriate place that we believe we can still address it.
But
Follow up, David?
It kind of quacks like a duck. I mean, it kind of looks like a standard. No. Okay. I'll cede the rest of my time.
Thank you very much. Siri, you now have the floor.
Okay, I really applaud this section for the reasons articulated by my colleagues and also that have been covered for decades. But why not take this further and include major requirements? Most of the studies, by the way, that we cite in this are from like 15 years ago, but there was a large, recent, rigorous study of 29,000 students in Texas, and it was by Gianni, Shuda, and Sultana in 2024, looking at vertical transfer. So that phenomena of community colleges, typically up to 4 years. And what they found is that students who lose 15 credits are up to 10 percentage points less likely to be retained by their receiving institution than those who lost no credits. But importantly, they distinguish between GCL, that's general credit loss, credits that aren't accepted at all, and MCL, which is major credit loss, which the credits are technically accepted, but they're relegated to elective status. And that's right now the wording that we have. And they don't advance progress toward a degree. Some folks would call this the academic graveyard. Their study, and I'm happy to send the PDF to everyone, shows that major credit loss proves more damaging to both retention and persistent than general credit loss. And And I think we've skated around this issue earlier, but students from low-income backgrounds and of color are disproportionately likely to begin their post-secondary journey at a community college. So the failure of accreditation standards to enforce meaningful credit portability isn't a neutral policy choice, it's a structural inequity, and there's no measurable consequences for degree attainment. To Michael's point on institutions and Jeffrey, for right now, unfortunately, the member institutions are able to maintain this incompatible articulation requirement, opaque credit evaluation practices, program-specific transfer barriers without some accountability as gatekeepers. And I look forward to the further discussion of this.
Thank you, Siri. Mike, you have the floor.
Thank you. I'm not the world's greatest poker player. When I reacted to your comment about students are, and many of our students are, right? They're working full time and they're going to school part time. So certainly there are many students that are taxpayers. On the margin, though, the $130 billion that taxpayers invest in higher education significantly dwarfs the amount of revenue we get from them today. On the backside of this, they are our taxpayers of the future, and that human capital investment that we make today is absolutely critical to the entire enterprise that we're here for. And so I think it's very important as we think about the value of those experiences. I mean, one of the most important conversations I think we've had in the last 12 months is about the return on investment, not just to the taxpayer, although that is important because of the tax revenues that come, but to the student and the idea that a degree will help them advance their quality of life and their ability to earn. And so I think those things all come together. What I love about this proposal by the department is that it balances some really hard things. One is there isn't, this isn't an area that you can, the department doesn't get to set these standards. This is what the accreditors do, right? I mean, this is the important part of this conversation. But it creates that same kind of pressure, and it's the same conversation we had yesterday around Section 602, 16, and 17, where we're talking about helping institutions start to think about bringing the cost of education down, right? This is such a critical part of our dialogue. And we can say, okay, it didn't just happen yesterday, and it hasn't. It's happened for decades when you had a finance system that kind of handed free money in many ways that had no accountability attached to it to institutions, or you gave loans to students to the point where you're looking at almost $2 trillion of potential liability. When you look at these systems, you realize the massive investment that the public makes and why it's so important. I mean, the students are exactly the reason we make these investments. And so, I think that as we think about how do we create these pressures in the institutions, this is a huge area of out-of-pocket costs for students. And yeah, it may come in the form of debt. It may come in the form of their own savings and earnings, may come from their family's mortgage, may come from a range of sources, but it's a huge area that we invest in as a system. Anything we can do to send a message down the road, I think helps, whether it's on the cost side or whether it's on this transfer side, which drives a big part of those costs for the student especially. And so I'm excited about the balance that we have here. I think one of the things that there is room to talk about, because they are required to have transfer policies, that's already in the statute. We could talk about transparency around those policies. I mean, not only are we talking about what does the program do, I want to know what the university's done. How many students have received transfer credit? What percentage of their credits transferred? What kind of institutions do they transfer from? I think I'm out of time. There's an opportunity to really lend that to the conversation. So one technical note on the first one, I want to point out that institutions that are in pre-accreditation sometimes are not allowed to transfer students, and so may not have transfer policy. So I think there's a technical issue we need to think about with respect to that.
Thank you, Mike. AD, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. Since everyone was talking about their own personal experience, I only transferred once, but I did have a child who did transfer twice and got credits from 3 schools to graduate with a bachelor's. So we're going to take a poll then and see who wins. But I do want to echo many of the comments made earlier. Julie mentioned both that not all courses are created equal, and also earlier when talking about teach outs that you want to have the strongest protections, but also not too burdensome for institution. And I think we've started with a healthy conversation. I'd like to see and hear more from institutions and those who accredit them. Is that we want to move forward much faster. Jennifer talked about we've come somewhere. I commend the department. We need to go a lot further. And if that means not going as far as this, but getting to have a next big step, and if that's 100, 200, or intro courses or certain things that are going to be significantly changed for students and make it, that would be a huge change. And if, working around those in this room to explain how that might work without, as far as we can, without being too burdensome, that it will actually end up being harming the student and not doing the student a favor, as we heard before. So that's where I'd like to see how far do we go with, and what protections we have so it doesn't hurt the students. Where institutions say, if you do that, that's too far. Like to get as close as we can to that.
Jeff?
Just quickly, and this touches also for what you just said, AD, and back to David's comment on why this isn't a standard. By putting it in here with procedures, it's a chance to use sort of the peer review process to look at best practices and look at how it's being implemented, and to allow the institution to push a little forward and give them recommendations to perhaps be more, I don't want to say lenient, but accept more credits, or at least put some more guidelines around how they're doing it. So again, this isn't a mandate. I'm hoping we don't have to get to a mandate, but I think this is, again, from a process standpoint, it's going to help move that and do the balancing that you just talked about, AD.
Thanks, Jeff. Jake, did you want to add to that?
Yeah, and not to beat a dead horse, the statute's pretty prescriptive about what can and can't be a standard here. So again, we can heavily encourage it. We can, belabor the point quite heavily to accreditors, but we can't explicitly put in there that they have to do something.
Thank you, Jeff. Thank you, Jake. Did you have any brief follow-up, AD?
Yeah, just briefly, let's say we were talking about, certain intro courses, certain courses, even if we can't mandate something, but you can say within this area, that's where we're encouraging.
Thank you, AD. I am going to call on Monty, Mark, David, and then Siri, and then we're going to take a break so we can move on with our other topics.
Brief. To your point a minute ago, generation to generation, one of the major changes and improvements that we've seen in transfer is students on average attending more institutions. And so one of the great challenges that comes about, as you can imagine, and I'm sure your son or daughter probably had this experience, collecting all those transcripts and getting them sent to that institution becomes a real challenge, right? So facilitating that. I want to just make two quick points. First, I mentioned a second ago the work in the Commonwealth. On the heels of the Restructuring Act in 2005 in the Commonwealth, there was a significant change in the approach to transfer. One of those prescribed that universities would begin to have some conversations with two-year colleges and build agreements that included some elements. For the student, time was issue number one. How long will it take you? Number two, cost. Those two could be tied together because there's a multiplier that goes with time, as we all recognize. The third element was completion of a degree at the two-year college level is a good thing. And so why wouldn't we put some type of benefit to the student as a result of completion of a degree? That I think is one element that is missing from the current proposal, but is something that might be worthwhile in us considering. Although we all recognize that most students do not transfer with a degree, they transfer with what is historically been called kind of a bag of credits, right? The last point that I'll make is in variability. Look, we saw a presentation from Cody on Monday that made clear in my own region that the variability in four-year institution graduation rates was somewhere from 15% to 90%. Guys, we can talk variability between two-year colleges all we want, but let's recognize that we all have variability. Let's not throw stones. This is not the way we get transfer improved, and it's not the way we move students through to completion. So I urge you to think about in those areas where we have seen major improvements in transfer, it's largely been as a result of state policy. You just mentioned a great example in Florida. We mirrored that in Louisiana when we went after the very same kinds of issues. So I would urge that we think about transferability as a function of institutional accreditation, which is exactly what the department has proposed. Thank you.
Thank you, Monty. Mark, you have the floor.
That was perfect because this is a follow-on and building on that and going back to Ray's comments about the experience in Florida, which he based in data. We don't necessarily need a new standard because we've already talked about outcomes. And so it would seem reasonable when reviewing institutions who have historically transferred a lot of students to other institutions. So I'm not limiting this to community colleges, any institution that's high transfer. We should look at the success, that the outcomes of those students who transfer. And it would seem to me that if the outcomes for students who transfer from institutions with high transfer, which is going to cover the majority of these cases, there should be a presumption of transferability. So it may be that Florida has high transfer, but if they want to go to Louisiana or Virginia or Georgia or Massachusetts, California, if there's already demonstrated they're coming from an institution where there's high success rates of transfer, meaning when I'm talking about success, completing a baccalaureate degree, if they're transferring to such an institution, then there should be a presumption those credits should be able to transfer. It shouldn't have to be done just within states. So that's maybe one way to get around not needing a standard, using the existing structure and putting data to work to better serve students and the taxpayers.
Thank you, Mark. David, you have the floor.
Thank you. And thank you for the clarifying comments about how this works. I understand it better. I probably should have before, but that makes it much clearer in my head. Just a couple of clarifying questions. It seems like it's written for undergraduate programs. Do you anticipate this working for graduate programs or specialized programs?
The regulation doesn't distinguish between it, but I think from looking at it from a policy perspective, it's more likely to occur in the undergraduate context.
That's where the pain is mainly.
Yeah.
Yeah. Second question, I think I know the answer, but it says in the last sentence, any denial shall include the cost. Does that mean we're quoting the cost or the institution is bearing the cost?
You're talking about in the last sentence, correct?
Yes, starts any denial provided to the student.
Yeah, so I think it's referring to the cost that the student would incur to repeat the course or to replace the credits.
I understand that, but is it that we are telling the student that that's what would be the case, or is the institution responsible for bearing the cost and waiving it?
No, it's quantifying the cost.
Okay, that's what I thought. I just wanted to clarify that. And just a quick closing comment about that. I think the time aspect of having peer review and accreditation involved in solving this very complicated problem is the right way to approach it because it's complicated, right? And we want to avoid second order effects. We don't want a low quality provider going out there and saying, hey, these credits are cheap. You can get them on the weekend and you can transfer them to any school in the country. And on the other side, we don't want to restrict transfer in because institutions start to become more conservative about it. So I think that gradual approach where we try to figure out how to solve this very complicated problem together is absolutely the right one.
Thank you, David. We are now going to take a 10-minute break, and when we return, we're going to move into the constitutional issues, as Jeff indicated earlier. I do want to make one quick procedural update. For the final 90 minutes, or this last part of the afternoon, I am going to waive the strict requirement that only a primary or alternate speak on a topic, and you are free to exchange a little bit more freely for this afternoon. I do ask that you be strategic and intentional with that because we still have to do that formally, and I don't want to spend our entire time just switching back and forth. So use this break, talk about how you might want to do that, but that's how we'll operate for the duration of the day. Thank you. Welcome back from break, everyone. I know that we're going to begin our constitutional issues. As a reminder, the procedural waiver is in effect. Before I turn it over to Jeff to maybe get us started, David, I do see your card.
I'd like to swap out with Bill Hathaway, please.
All right, we're going to welcome alternate Bill Hathaway to the main table on behalf of private nonprofit institutions. Jeff, is there anything you'd like to share to tee up this segment?
Yeah. To tee this up. So what we'd like to do is to break this conversation maybe up into two parts. One where we're talking about academic freedom and topic and intellectual diversity, and then one where we're talking about the impact of the civil rights and other federal and state laws and compliance with those on accreditation. Those are sprinkled throughout these regulations and appear in multiple sections. And so it seemed like every time we get to a section, people would raise issues. So we'll talk more about the academic freedom first, I think, in the first half, and then I think we pivot to the others. But we're here more to listen than to talk. We want to hear other folks' views. I will tee it off by saying, at least on this intellectual diversity issue, that our policy is coming from the executive order, where we believe that accreditation or educational quality, and this is really where we want less of a legalistic, but really talking about it in terms of quality, that quality really requires that institutions support and appropriately prioritize intellectual diversity in the faculty. And that is a way to advance academic freedom, intellectual inquiry, and student learning outcomes. And so that's to frame the context. And if people want to talk more about, viewpoint diversity, that is really the inclusion of a wide range of perspectives and ideologies and intellectual approaches within the institution. So I know this can get highly politicized. We are not trying to bring the culture wars into this, but it is an important topic. It is something that's been out there in public discourse, is not in the view of many people in the public, not being present in our colleges and universities. And we would like to have some discussion on that. And I would also like to say that this is not an attempt by the administration to put any particular ideology forcing down anyone's throat. And for those who articulate that particular point of view, I think you should look at the source, where that's coming from. A lot of that's coming from people who have either served in prior administrations or have a vested interest in trying to preserve the status quo. So with that, I will turn this over to you all, and we can begin the discussion.
Thank you, Jeff. Committee members, I invite you to indicate through your comment cards if you have comments or questions on academic freedom or intellectual diversity. Bill, I see your card. I'll ask that you get us started, and then I'll be back over to you, Magnus.
Okay, just a structural comment. So we have these comments peppered throughout the proposed revisions. I wonder if it might make more sense to try to pool them in one area that really focuses and crystallizes what we're trying to achieve. I understand they could have implications for different aspects of the regulations, but it does feel at times like it's a bit overlapping and redundant. And I certainly do appreciate the viewpoint issue. I think that's something that's been a concern for me in my academic development throughout my whole career. Having said that, if you could clarify, I understand the executive order, but what is the rationale for what the relevant authority or interest is within the Higher Ed Act in that space? So again, I'm not challenging it. I'm just wondering under what context we're bringing this in.
I appreciate you bringing this up, Bill. Again, we're bringing this up as a component of academic quality, and we're not, trying to push too far in one direction or the other. This exists within a whole realm of constitutional law and other on the civil rights, a whole body of federal and state laws as well. So we're trying to deal with this within the context of existing law, and navigate through that. So if that helps you, and one of those, and I know particularly from your institution, I mean, there's obviously a lot of case law around the First Amendment, around the Establishment Clause, and the free exercise.
Thank you, Jeff. Bill, did you have any brief follow-up?
Not at this time.
Thank you, Bill. Magnus, you have the floor.
Yeah, I just want to mention in my very recent and current experience as a student, if I understand what the department means by intellectual diversity among faculty, this is an area where I see quite a bit of diversity among faculty. You know, I went to a rural community college, and now go to a university in a state capital. So I do see, trying to toe the line here, I do see a lot of diversity in terms of viewpoint, ideology, et cetera. And it's my opinion that the concept of academic freedom is where this intellectual diversity is sort of implied generally, because faculty members have the ability to share their viewpoints in a way that is not permissible, perhaps in the K-12 system for teachers and things like that. So I want to ask the department how they see examples of intellectual diversity among faculty play out. How would you expect institutions to integrate this into their hiring decisions for faculty? And then that's A, and then B, how do you see the role of accreditors in this? And then C, how does that not conflict with existing employment law and non-discrimination law in regards to hiring and things like that, in terms of questions that you cannot ask?
So as I said, this is looking at this from the perspective of educational quality and the perspective of the accreditation process. And so we're overlaying the concept throughout the different steps of the process here. So I'm not going to get into any specifics and hypotheticals on this. I think, but what we're talking about is a good education, in our view, requires a wide, within the realm of existing law, requires a wide range of perspectives and approaches. And so that's where I think we want to have this conversation on where within the various parts of the accreditation process we can look at that and try to push towards that goal of having a wider range of views and making sure that, again, we're still protecting folks within their exercise of their, from the religious perspective and other parts of that mission. So,
if you have brief follow-up, Magnus, otherwise I'll circle back.
I do have brief follow-up. So I would just say then that's the department's perspective. So I'd ask accreditors at the table, like Michael and Mark, how they would measure intellectual diversity and what are examples of findings that would warrant the sanctions that are laid out in the regulations.
Thank you, Magnus. I'm going to move on and give Jennifer the floor. Oh,
can I just clarify? There are no sanctions within this. Again, this is really talking about the quality and the approach.
Thank you. Jennifer, please.
Along those lines of there are no sanctions. So I'm just thinking about, and Bill, thanks for bringing it up, because I was going to go there too, of trying to centralize rather than having both, frankly, the academic freedom and intellectual diversity and the civil rights and compliance with laws sections. I think there are a couple of places where I can understand why you might have them specifically in a section, but they are all over the place now. And so I've already begun thinking, took the liberty of thinking about because instead of just saying, oh, can we put it someplace like where the where would be? And Michael and I also talked about it. And wondering if the department would entertain, before we get into what we mean potentially in the substantive around the terms or whatever, it seems like a place where they could live is 60228, which is on page 109, which is now titled Regard for Decisions of States and Other Accrediting Agencies, but that title could be changed. And there are other references in that section to regard for actions taken by states or federal government. I'm just wanting to advance the ball on what an idea might be for the where and whether you'll even entertain the single location. And when I say single location, it might be multiple sections because they're different topics, but that they would all live in one place.
Thank you, Jennifer. Jeff?
We just thank you for this suggestion. Yeah, we're open to some of the ideas, both the one that Bill raised and what you raised as well. So,
Thank you, Jeff. Mark, you have the floor.
Yes, so this is just a question to get started. So as I go through the document, First Amendment appears, I cannot find any occurrences of the word diversity, let alone intellectual diversity. Viewpoint does show up 3 times. Freedom of inquiry shows up once. But in looking at any of these, I'm just trying to get a range of what the department is thinking. Is it that you expect institutions to have policies, or are you expecting them to actually have some active monitoring process that is to be evaluated, or might it be nothing more than, so let's take First Amendment, since it is covered by the Constitution and law, is it the absence or presence of legal proceedings and legal outcomes that are adverse to the institution?
yeah, I don't think it's that legalistic, and legalistic in approach. I think what we're really looking for is that institutions are supporting the concept and are working towards that and have policies that are focused on presenting students in whatever fields that they're studying with a wide variety of viewpoints, as opposed to a very narrow set.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you, Jeff. Siri, you have the floor.
Wow. All right. So for the record, I just want to put a few comments on around academic freedom and intellectual diversity. First, I'll speak from a personal level. My parents met at a Gwendolyn Brooks poetry reading February 14th, 1970 at Kent State, which was very much a free speech event. And my father asked my mother for a pencil. And as a faculty member, I absolutely cherish academic freedom and intellectual diversity in my classroom and in my optional, but students often take me up on it, coming over for a classroom dinner where we can continue those conversations at my home. Let me just now speak to this from the perspective of workforce development needs, professional associations, and employers. Innovation requires intellectual risk-taking. The workforce depends on graduates who can challenge assumptions, propose novel solutions, and tolerate uncertainty. Academic freedom creates the conditions under which students learn to engage with contested ideas. And these are absolutely foundational to entrepreneurship, R&D, knowledge-intensive industries. Working through diversity is also a workforce competency. Employers across sectors, finance, healthcare, technology, law, increasingly require workers who can reason across disciplinary and ideological frameworks and engage with adversarial viewpoints and synthesize competing evidence. I believe that academic freedom protects the integrity of credentialing. When faculty can't teach or research outside of approved paradigms, the degrees they confer reflect institutional consensus rather than rigorous inquiry. And since employers and licensing bodies rely on these, it's pretty important. And then let me just conclude with a couple other comments that the suppression of dissent distorts labor market signals. So when the academic culture penalizes heterodox inquiry, talented researchers and scholars self-select out of the academy or self-censor. I've known many of these. This produces a talent drain and distorts the research agenda away from socially valuable but politically inconvenient questions. Those are especially relevant for economics, health. And then finally, just on the connection to accreditation, any accreditor that imposes some ideological uniformity through standards, required curricular, faculty credentialing norms, essentially functions as a gatekeeper of intellectual permissibility, not just academic quality, but of course it affects quality for the reasons outlined above. That's it.
Thank you, Siri. Raymond, you now have the floor.
Thank you, and I appreciate it. I'm going to start with, what is the mission of higher education? What is the purpose? The reason higher education exists is it's the search for truth. The search for truth, and then the revelation of that truth taught to students, passing on that knowledge. If you look at the concept of academic freedom, there's Supreme Court ruling out there where they have acknowledged that academic freedom is a special concern. There are other Supreme Court rulings that acknowledge that a university classroom is a marketplace of ideas. You can't have the search for truth without a marketplace of ideas and the academic freedom to pursue research that challenges the prevailing theory. That's how new truth is revealed. That has long been the understanding of how our higher education is supposed to work. And if you go back and read those Supreme Court rulings, clearly the underpinning of the reasoning of the justices as they were issued. But what we have seen today is different. Inside Higher Ed published a poll that they did with Hanover Research Group end of October of 2024. It was a presidential poll specific to faculty members, national poll. And the vice president, Kamala Harris, won that poll 78% to 8% for those who were indicating they intended to vote for Donald Trump. That is a clear indication that a monoculture is developing across our campuses. That's political polls, just a snapshot. If you wanted, by the end of the day, I could give you a half dozen studies from research conducted by academics that verify our institutions have shifted over the last 25 years significantly to the left. But that political poll illustrates it, which is why I put it out there. In public universities, taxpayers are paying for that education. It is not their expectation that the universities they are paying for are going to be a monoculture captured by the political minority to push the agenda of the political minority on everyone else. The expectation is higher education is going to fulfill its mission, which is the search for truth, and that pursuit of the truth will include a marketplace of ideas that includes a broad range of intellectual diversity to do so. So I'm sad in a way that we have to articulate intellectual diversity as an expectation, but that is where we are today, that we need to articulate intellectual diversity is an expectation. So I support what we're doing here.
Thank you, Raymond. Monty, you have the floor.
Just want to swap with Luciano.
Okay, thank you very much. On behalf of Public Institutions of Higher Education, we'll bring to the table alternate Luciano de Castro. While you are swapping, Michael, you have the floor.
I'm going to wait.
Thank you, Michael. That would mean I am moving on to Mike, please.
I kind of want to hear what he has to say first. I don't know. This is one of the most important issues that's before us. I mean, we talk a lot about accreditation and its purpose to preserve quality in education. The two words we never define are quality and education. And intrinsic in the public investment in higher education and in all education is the sense that we're developing what we call responsible or informed citizens. I mean, it's attributed to Jefferson, but George Washington in his farewell address advocated for the creation of a national public university for the very purpose of teaching students the science of government, the idea that we can figure out how to govern our communities together. And this has been fundamental to higher education and its mission and purpose throughout American history. And in fact, the fear of many of the founders of this republic was that our students would go to Europe and learn crazy ideas. And so there was a deep sense that we wanted to have American ownership and that there was something unique about the American experience in this capacity. And if you think about the quality of education, we've all talked about it, and we've spent decades trying to get students to do critical thinking, for example, which is this idea that we can dissect problems and draw conclusions and come to answers. But especially with the advent of social media and the way it's redesigned a lot of our social order, we have an even bigger problem today, which is how do we get people to communicate and to communicate constructively? And I mean, this hearing is a phenomenal example of a process where we're bringing together diverse perspectives to work and build a consensus. Almost all of our students in K-12 do not have this experience in most institutions. And in many of our universities, unfortunately, they don't necessarily have it there. Now, some of this goes to the argument about monoculture that we've talked about, where in fact, the diversity of perspectives on campus has eroded over time. I did an analysis of one institution. One of the university presidents was at an event, and she was proudly talking about the progress that she's made, and she had great ideas. But when you look at the faculty, it was worse than 70%. It was 95% of their political campaign contributions of the faculty went to left or far left causes. And this isn't about politics, but it gives you an indication of the balance and the kind of voices that are on campus. And I got 30 seconds to wrap this up. Wow. So as we think about this conversation, I think it's really important for us to think about what education is and how we train the next generation of folks who are going to sit in this room in 10 or 15 years on how to have these conversations. And right now, in our education process, the authority for this, I think, comes completely out of the realm of quality, because if we can't create that dialogue in our classrooms, then they just become informational indoctrination centers instead of places where we can actually deliberate and make good choices.
Thank you, Mike. Julie, you have the floor.
Thank you. Something that stood out to me yesterday when we were having these conversations, I'm going to bring us back into the text, take us to page 43, section F, where it highlights that the agency should evaluate whether an institution, sorry, I'm talking really fast, whether an institution restricts publicans, from fulfilling their obligations under the First Amendment to the Constitution of the United States. Something that stood out to me that Michael said yesterday is that accreditors don't have an investigative wing. They don't have the resources to conduct said investigations, to ensuring First Amendment or any other civil rights violations. It just seems like something they're not capable of. So I think, and please correct me if I'm wrong on that, but I'm just curious how the department plans on having accreditors be the arbiter of these potential violations. Like, is this documented official violations that have been filed with the accreditors? And again, do students know who their accreditor is? I'm just wondering how the accreditors are going to be empowered to actually fulfill that portion. If we could flesh that out just a little bit, please.
Sure. Again, these changes are not putting accreditors into a role of becoming compliance officers for the Department of Education. In fact, that's one thing in our experience since the 92 amendments that we've sort of reached a peaceful coexistence with the accreditors. That they have a way of doing things, and they're not auditors, and they're not state agencies, and so we've tried to live within that approach. However, one of the requirements, I think, for almost all accreditors that I've seen is that people are compliant with that the institutions are acting in compliance with the law. And with civil rights in particular, First Amendment, people have private rights of action. There are law enforcement, either through federal or state, where actions are taken. And so we want those to be considered as part of the process. I have had correspondence personally with several accreditors on places where we've had findings of noncompliance with federal laws that I have followed up with the accreditors on, and the accreditors have pursued actions under their standards and looked into it. So it's something that we already do, but I think what we're doing here is really trying to highlight that requirement specifically around, because of the concerns of potential violations of the First Amendment. We want to make sure that that standard is paramount, but it is not putting accreditors into a investigatory and I don't think any of those provisions actually require a proactive, like you have to launch an investigation type of thing. It's generally in response to some other action that's been taken elsewhere.
Thank you, Jeff. Jake, did you want to add to that?
Yeah, I think, in regard to that, I would say that this isn't necessarily that different from where we require the accreditors to enforce standards about sufficiency of buildings and physical plants. Presumably accreditors aren't in the business of engineering or, large scale macroeconomics either, but they are expected to ensure that they have standards in place for institutions and that, they're at least performing a cursory review to make sure that institutions are attempting to uphold those standards. So while we don't expect them to, be the ones on the ground making sure all the sprinklers work, we do expect them to uphold or ensure that there are standards in place. And I think that the same logic applies here. We're not expecting accreditors to be the police. We're just expecting them to, ensure that, their institutions are working for the good of their students and to try to prize intellectual diversity and, like Jeff said, to, at least react when they see something or their institutions doing something that's concerning in this area.
Thank you, Jake. Julie, brief follow-up.
I was just going to say thank you for that thoughtful response.
Thank you, Julie. Jennifer, you have the floor.
There's no shortage of other people having thoughts on this, but I did want to go to I just think it's actually kind of helpful to pull out the specific language from the EO, from the executive order, just because to me it provided some direction in my thinking. And so I want to just quickly read it, and I would be interested in thoughts around the specific language, because I think in the regs, in the proposed regs, the term, there's use of First Amendment and the Constitution, but in the EO, it actually, to me, spells out what they meant, what the president, I guess, meant, what the executive office meant. So it says accreditation requires that, this is what he's recommending, accreditation requires that institutions support and appropriately prioritize intellectual diversity amongst faculty in order to advance academic freedom, intellectual inquiry, and student learning. So, I might wordsmith a little bit around requires, because it's sort of a review process of what, so I might wordsmith the front end of that. But I'm curious to know what other people think around the table, or the alternates think about that language directionally. To me, it's just, I don't love having the Constitution mentioned in regs. It's a general rule. So I'm just curious. I'm not saying I'm wed to this language. Oh, and I just wanted to add, with a lot of sympathy, not just to the religious, faith-based institutions, because that definitely needs to be worked into anything we write, in my view. But I would actually also say in a manner consistent with the missions of an institution, because there are, you still want intellectual diversity, so I support that, but it does need to be consistent with what they are teaching. Like, we're not expecting intellectual diversity on topics that are not part of, especially if it's a single-focused institution.
Thank you, Jennifer. Jeff?
Yeah, and I guess the only point I would try to just introduce into the conversation there is that if you look at the case law, and I think Ray pointed to this a little bit earlier, there are distinctions made between public institutions and private institutions with regard to academic freedom.
Any brief follow-up, Jennifer, before I move along?
Well, yes, I mean, there are, but I think in terms of the classroom piece of it, and it sounds funny for me to be saying like, but this EO covers both of those bases in that sentence that I just read. So I don't think that, I mean, they mention academic freedom, but they also mention intellectual inquiry and student learning. And to me, the First Amendment issue is a slightly different issue.
So academic freedom is sort of a subset of the case law on First Amendment. And that's really where we're heading through. And again, as I said at the outset, what we're trying to achieve here is against the backdrop of the legal landscape that that we have currently.
Thank you, Jennifer. Thank you, Jeff. Jake, please.
Yeah, I think Jeff brings up a good point. Academic freedom is a subset of the First Amendment case law, especially even in regards to universities. Part of this comes down to a good amount of the case law that we have in this area involves public schools, either at the secondary level or universities, punishing staff for either expressing First Amendment views outside of the classroom or otherwise engaging in protected activities. So academic freedom is really a smaller subset within that, whereas, the First Amendment language here is a little bit broader and, protects people against I think if nothing else, stressing that we want the same thought process to go into it. And we don't want institutions engaging in reprisals against people for expressing their views.
15 seconds, Jennifer.
Okay, so I wasn't going to go there, but you just did. So, so the First Amendment issues are largely around issues that happen outside the classroom. And so in terms of academic quality, I was trying to zero in on the EO, which to me seems very focused on the classroom. And accreditors actually focus mostly on the classroom. And so I do begin to get concerned when we're having accreditors, federal government, different story, but I do get concerned when we're talking in the context of having accreditors look at, and I know they look at facilities, but I do think it's very different because they're looking at facilities as it relates to the teaching. So I get concerned about having accreditors looking too far into activities outside of the academic experience. I'll call it the academic experience.
Thank you. Jake?
Yeah, I think we actually don't want them looking at that. That's the bigger point here. We don't want accreditors putting policies in place that restrict those things. So in terms of things outside of the academic arena, in terms of First Amendment issues, we don't want them putting in their own policies that would restrict people from expressing those First Amendment or using their First Amendment rights.
Okay, if there's more there, I will circle back. Bill, thank you for your patience. You have the floor.
Just a couple of things that are slightly different topics. So on this issue of viewpoint differences, I think we've already acknowledged this, but faith-based private institutions, sometimes other kinds of institutions with specific missions, I think I mentioned military before, may need to have an affinity around a viewpoint for them to function. I know at least one approved accreditor that recognizes those different kinds of settings, public and private, including faith-based, and their distinctive impact on how they operate as an expression of American viewpoint inclusion. So it's a positive take on it and affirms that those private faith-based entities have a right to operate consistent with their rights, which is sort of nice. At any rate, so I just would acknowledge that in those contexts, you may have affinity requirements around something like a religious mission that would seem by some to be against sort of more of a viewpoint neutrality kind of perspective. And we say that in one of our places here. I think we're going to have someone follow up on a piece of that. The second set of issues, there's at least three places, two related to what I'm bringing up now, where we talk about not having preferences based on race at any institution. And forgive my ignorance here, but I would just like as a point of clarification. So when we have HBCUs or tribal colleges, can they use preferences around race in some of their hiring or other practices?
So both HBCUs and tribal institutions are, we recognize those designations as mission, not based on racial composure.
Okay.
And so, which is different than how Congress had treated, for example, the definition of Hispanic serving institution, which is a percentage based, and it is based on enrollment. So yeah, we don't see a conflict in there. We also know that a number of those institutions have removed, for example, having race-based scholarships. And so that it's things that are where the decisions are based solely on or exclusively on race.
Thank you, Jeff. Bill, any brief follow-up?
No, I think that fits what I expected was the perception here. Is there a de facto preference, though, because of the nature of the topic and the special mission, that turns into something like a preference? And if so, would this interfere with it, or would we intend to curtail that?
We don't see a conflict here in these regulations with institutions such as tribally controlled institutions and historically Black colleges and universities.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Bill. Thank you, Jeff. Luciano, I'm going over to you and then back to you, Magnus. You have the floor.
Thank you. I just want to highlight when you go back to why we need or we like freedom of speech, it goes back to Stuart Mill when he builds the argument that we need the freedom to express ourselves and leave the ideas to compete so that the truth comes out. This is the process. That's the best process that we have. And for this, the ideal world is exactly that we have the capacity that people express their ideas, they show their viewpoints, and the best viewpoints prevails, right? And this is why academia is so wonderful in this respect. What the department is doing, and I highly praise your attitude and what you're trying to do, is just to bring back the neutrality with respect to the viewpoint. But this is a very basic objective, and I would say that's even minimal. When we go back and look at what's the reality, I want to comment about some of the things that have been said. There are multiple papers, books. There is a lot of evidence that academia has shifted left, and that it's overwhelming, representing one side of the spectrum. There is no debate about this. The evidence is overwhelming. There is some debate about what's the cause of this, and there are some debates about what it means, but there is no debate about this fact. And one of the things that we have observed also is that because of this predominance, a lot of faculty have been persecuted by their views. And this is bad for exactly the purpose that I remind at the beginning, the pursuit of truth. So I highly praise this initiative. I would say that it's very mild because it's just requiring neutrality. We, at the end, to get to the ideal world, we have to do much more than that. That is actually to force everyone to accept all the viewpoints. And the department is not requiring this. It's just requiring that the agencies respect the neutrality of viewpoint. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Magnus, you have the floor.
Thank you. So correct me if I'm wrong, but Jeff, I think at the beginning, you mentioned the point of this discussion and the definition used for intellectual diversity was not meant to be construed with or represent political diversity or diversity in political viewpoint. So I think a few of the comments that have been made are failing to toe the line between these two definitions. So Ray gave the example of one single poll during the last presidential election that showed that, 94% of faculty or something supported one candidate over the other. And Michael S. over here brought up the idea of political campaign contributions from faculty members at colleges, and those are purely political metrics, and that is political ideology, not intellectual diversity. So I would argue that faculty members, and it has been my experience as a student, that even if that may be the case, those metrics are true, there is a great expanse of intellectual diversity among faculty, regardless of their political leanings. So, as I said, I think we may be failing to toe the line here, and we may be failing the sobriety test. When a police officer walks you down a line, and I think we might be stumbling over it. So, I do want to maybe pull us back into the idea of intellectual diversity, not diversity in political ideology, because as Luciano stated, the best idea needs to win.
Thank you, Magnus. Jake and Jeff, which of you would like to speak to this first?
I'm going to speak to it first, if Jake doesn't mind. I think, what was brought up here as examples are examples of perhaps sort of the converse of this, which is the suppression of free speech, and, the fact that there is a singular, perhaps, ideology that is prevalent on a number of campuses. And It's ironic because some of the critics of our regulations have called this that these regulations obliterate autonomy for institutions. In fact, if the only thing these regulations obliterate is the autonomous ability of an institution to suppress free speech. So that's what they address. We are trying to promote free speech. We are trying to promote diversity. And so I don't think everybody would agree with you that the institutions are entirely diverse in terms of ideology. I went to an institution that right here in Washington, D.C., which did not have a tremendous amount of diversity. And I see with this, I will yield, if everybody's okay with it, to my distinguished colleague, Dr. David Barker, who is also a faculty member who can maybe share some of his perspectives as well.
Welcome, David, to the table. You have the floor.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Jeff. I think it's a great question that you're raising, Magnus, on what do we mean by intellectual diversity and different viewpoints. And I just have to say that the highest quality education I've ever had was when different points of view were presented, and often on technical issues. My background's in economics, and at Berkeley, I had a course where they specifically team taught. There were two professors who had different views on technical macroeconomic issues, who really believed their point of view, right? And that's best when you have people who believe their point of view instead of someone who's just trying to express the view that they think others have. At the London School of Economics, I had professors who ranged from communists, real communists, who believed in economic planning and presented that, to center-left professors who disagreed with that. At the University of Chicago, on the PhD program there, we had tremendous debates all the time between faculty members. And when there wasn't enough difference in viewpoint there, they brought in outside speakers, and then they hired people so that they would have someone to argue with. And, that's the kind of highest quality, I think, education. And even on, in scientific matters, right? When continental drift was mocked by a lot of, people in the field, and this new theory was emerging, they should have, been bringing people in to present this new point of view. As a regent at a public university system, I was shocked. I expected there to be less viewpoint diversity than when I was in college and graduate school, but I was shocked by the lack of diversity. It was almost impossible to find people with different points of view on economic or political issues. I did a couple of studies of and I understand it's not all about political diversity, but sometimes those things are related in certain fields like political science or economics. And there was no diversity to be found. And I also studied classroom content and how it related. And there was almost, in certain courses, there was no diversity of viewpoint presented to students. And I think that's an important quality issue that accreditors do have a good reason to deal with. Thank you.
Thank you, David.
Then I'll yield to Jake if he has any closing.
Well, I mean, I don't have nearly as passionate a statement as either of the two of them, nor such good examples. I do want to point out, though, that the way the regs are written is facially neutral in terms of politics. It's not left, it's not right. And I would like to point out that historically we have seen the pendulum swing all over the place. Much of the case law, the largest pieces of case law that we have in this area, are in relation to university or states imposing laws that either required faculty to take oaths swearing that they weren't communist, or depose or firing people who were suspected communists. So, obviously in the 50s, this was the opposite direction in terms of, who was perceived to have power in different places. I just think we should bear that in mind, that, we write all of these regs very much with the idea that, different administrations will come in and steward them. And this is written to be as neutral as possible and to really encourage, institutions to try to prize this for the sake of their students, not to punish any, specific ideology, nor to really curb any, beliefs. It's the opposite, actually. We want people to have strong beliefs. We want them to express them loudly, and we want them to feel safe in doing so. That's the best outcome for students. That's the best outcome for all of us.
Did you have something additional, Jeff?
Yeah, and just to close, and I think, and I'm not trying to invalidate your perspective and my remarks on that, Magnus, because I think there has been a generational shift. But when I sort of look at diversity, I think about the scene in the movie The Blues Brothers, where they walk into the bar and they say, "What kind of music do you play here?" And they say both kinds, country and Western, and so. I think we have to sort of, step back in perspective in terms of where we are at the moment.
Magnus, very brief feedback, and then I'd like to move on.
Yeah, as an Illinois native, I appreciate the Blues Brothers reference. But thank you for the discourse. However, I do think my point stands. Thank you.
Thank you, Magnus, Jake, Jeff, and David. I am now going to move on to AD. Thank you for your patience.
Thank you very much. And I do think from the experience and the feedback we've gotten from students that that lack of a diversity in higher education does have a detrimental effect, especially in some cases where their viewpoints of the students are based on their religion. And so I think it is very important that we do make things a lot better. The one place where I urge caution is where the student attends a religious university, whether that's exclusively on religion or it has a religious mission. And in this case, we're dealing with accreditors who are overseeing those. So I commend the department. I was trying, like at least in one example, page 57, where we are trying to protect those accrediting agencies that do have religious mission. I do have a suggestion on possibly language throughout to the department. Ask that's the direction that they would be amenable to, and anybody else at the table as well. And I'm not married to the fact that it has to stay on page 57 in section 4. As we talked about, if we're going to write overarching language, this could be either in multiple places or in one place that apply. But just this idea that the wording right now is that nothing in this paragraph requires an accrediting agency with a religious mission to be neutral with respect to religious viewpoints. So the sentiment, we agree 100%. I would ask that, would you be open to taking out the word religious viewpoints? I'd be nervous about starting to, how do we measure what is or isn't a religious viewpoint? Different religions have different accrediting agencies, institutions, religions might have a different idea of what is exclusively religious or not. Would there be any reason if we take the same sentence, just take out the word religious viewpoints? So if it's an accrediting agency with a religious mission, with respect to viewpoints or something along those lines.
Yeah, I would hesitate to make that decision here at the table. And I think I've probably overused the term, we'll take it back on people's bingo cards back home that are watching this. So but I think if you can put something in thoughtful in writing for us, along the lines of what you just said, we can look at it when we have sort of a quieter time and we have more minds around the table and take a look at it and see how we can make it fit.
Thank you, Jeff. AD, any brief follow-up?
No, good. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to Mike and then Michael.
Thank you. It's been a long time since I've been called drunk on political ideology, but I think that, the numbers I cited were a symptom of a real problem on campuses. And I don't think there's anybody who's spent time in a university that doesn't see that set of issues. I was a professor for 24 years at a school that has a reputation as being a conservative institution. The foundation at Pepperdine, the foundation of that reputation was we allowed conservative students into the program. I had colleagues at Berkeley, at the policy school there, begging me to loan them our faculty to come up and give a lecture so that they could have faculty in the room who could bring a different perspective to the table. So there is a known sense in institutions that this is a real problem. I think that, we as folks who are thinking about the future of higher education, when we think about this dimension of the quality of the higher education experience, need to be serious and deliberate about how we make that happen, how we foster that intellectual curiosity. I worked for the last 3 years launching the University of Austin, who raised over $200 million to launch a university where we could have open discourse and a civil dialogue in the pursuit of truth. Not that we had truth, and I think this is the problem many universities get themselves in, but that we were humble enough to accept that we didn't know what truth is and we were pursuing it. I think higher education needs to rediscover, that is the essence of educational inquiry. And that is where academic freedom and everything else fits into this equation. And I think those are the pieces that we need to rediscover in this process. I think that, somebody was talking about what's the role of accreditors in this. For 60 years now, we've asked accreditors to answer the question, how do you foster diversity on campus? Why can we not ask accreditors, as part of our central definition of what quality is, to ask them, how do you pursue the intellectual debate, controversy, weighing of facts? It's not just critical thinking, it's that human aspect of it. I mean, there's a reason why a recent survey by Rutgers found that 31% of our population thought it was okay to kill somebody if you didn't like their ideas. I mean, these are terrifying numbers. We've isolated the human debate and discourse from the conversation. And this is exactly the vision that our founders had in saying we want to create responsible citizens. So I applaud the department's efforts to do this. I think there's some areas where we can make it better, probably. But I do think that this focus on discourse as part of quality has to absolutely be central to what we're doing here.
Thank you, Mike. Jeff, please.
I'm again looking at the time, and I know we wanted to make the pivot. I'd like to have some discussion around the civil rights parts. Let's maybe, if there are new points that people want to add to this, let's have them. But I think we should be pivoting pretty soon.
Okay, folks, new points on that perhaps, but we do want to transition at this time, given that we only have 20 minutes left. Michael, you have the floor.
I decided to wait because I thought that practitioners around the table and would be far better suited to speak about the necessity or the importance of these issues in the classroom. And what I want to now give you all that opportunity to have that. I'm not going to repeat any of those things. I want to talk about what can we expect accreditors to reasonably do. And I'm not going to be, I'm going to cede my seat also to Heather, and she has an important perspective on this as well. But, there's kind of been this idea that, well, we're not really asking accreditors to do, that they must do anything, but it's very close. And so when it says the agency should evaluate whether the institution restricts public institutions from fulfilling their obligations under the First Amendment to the Constitution of the United States, that's a big ask for accreditors to assess whether the institution restricts such things. Now, it's something different to say require policies that the institution adheres to with regard to academic freedom or with regard to diversity of ideas or, an educational environment that's conducive to a range of viewpoints. Those kinds of things are things that we can see. They have a policy. How do we know that policy works? Well, we would look at a variety of things, both likely qualitative, but things like, do we get student complaints about this? Do we hear, are there media reports? Are there other indicia that would demonstrate that they're really not following that policy? So those are things that we can actually do. And so I would be mindful of what you're asking for accreditors to do, and are we really going to be able to do it? And then I'll just pivot quickly to, because you asked for civil rights. Under the proposed addition here, student support services must comply with all civil rights laws. We can't make that determination. The only way for us to make that determination is the absence of any finding of a body of jurisdiction that has made that finding. We cannot make a determination that they comply with all civil rights. It goes on to say that student support services of public institutions must also comply with the First Amendment. There's no way for us to make that determination either. as an accreditor. That's actually asking the accreditor to make a determination that student support services do in fact comply with the First Amendment. So again, those are just things that we are effectively not able to do. So having policies and procedures. So what I would really suggest is we try to find a place where it can live, one place, have an expectation, whether it's in 28 or 24 or somewhere else, that just has expectations around these things. I might suggest 24 just because we finished up on transfer of credit and it's a little bit of a wonky place, but that's where right after transfer of credit decisions, you could probably fit in academic freedom and have a statement there about what is the expectation for institutions to say, here is our academic freedom policy. Here's what it consists of. The same way that we are doing it for transfer of credit, it would flow right from that under 24. And
Thank you, Michael. Do you want to do the exchange now or wait? Michael, are we exchanging seats now or waiting? Okay, then I want to welcome Heather Perfetti on behalf of institutional accrediting agencies. I'm going to continue moving on with cards as we exchange that. Brian, you have the floor.
Thank you. I really appreciate the discussion. And I think, looking across programmatic creditors, the question, I think Michael said this aptly, is, how is this tool should be created that the current approach may not be well aligned with the outcomes that the department is seeking. As drafted, the language introduced ambiguity around scope, particularly with respect to viewpoints, academic freedom, civil rights, and related considerations. And it may create challenges in inconsistent and ineffective implementation. Part of this from the programmatic accreditors is that without clear definitions or operational components, which I think we're starting to suggest that how we put this into language, the framework really risks producing variability, unintended consequences, and potential legal and administrative complications, rather than advancing the intended goals of the accountability and student protection. So I think from the stakeholders, or at least from the programmatic accreditors, is what we're asking is to refine the language to ensure that it's clearly scoped, operationally feasible, and aligned with the established roles of accreditors.
Jeff, would you like to speak to that?
Just a quick clarifying question for Dr. Kessler on that. So I hear you with regard to our approach. With regard to the goals and the objectives, and we've had a lot of discussion. We've teed this off in terms of what we expect in this. Are you against what we're trying to achieve, and are you committed to working with us to try to make this a workable objective within the existing framework?
I think how this process is laid out, looking towards kind of achieving some sort of approach to this. And I think that's what this whole discord has been about. I think Jennifer so aptly said, as we start to look where this is placed and how this is articulated, because I think that what that does is create some sort of framework that this can be operationalized, but also giving some sort of guide rails or at least components so that when the accreditors go after this is not looking to just say, well, yes, it's a punitive measure or something else, so that they can clearly define that. Hopefully that answered your question.
I appreciate that clarification. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeff. Thank you, Brian. Ray?
I'd like to switch out with Chancellor Duffy.
Perfect. We are going to bring Mike to the table on behalf of state officials, including governors. While you're doing that exchange, Heather, I'd like to give you the floor.
Thanks, Kayla. And thank you, everyone, for the conversation. I've been taking quite a bit of notes. I would also bring it back to the context of accreditation. I think that, as others have indicated, there are probably better ways to generally reference adherence to federal and state laws. And every accreditor currently requires institutions to adhere to federal and state laws. And so that would be consistent with current practice as well. I do think that bringing the provisions that are peppered throughout the proposal together would help streamline the information and bring clarity around purpose as well. I think that it also accounts for changes in interpretations of federal law or changes in case law that may impact positioning around some of these concepts at the highest level. But I also felt it important to reiterate that many accreditors, most actually capture these concepts already within standards. So I was curious if the department has done an analysis of the standards for accreditation within the accreditation community to see what kinds of language may already exist that could be helpful to the effort that you all have put forward.
Yeah, I think we're generally familiar with the changes. We track most of the changes in standards that the accreditors have. Yeah, definitely appreciate that comment. Just to your point, and you acknowledge sort of the changing nature of the body of law that's out there. And so I would like to get a better sense, for example, when Students for Fair Admissions was decided, what process did your agency go through when that significant change in law happened, and looking at your own standards and how to bring them into compliance with the change in case law?
So our standards do indicate that institutions are expected to comply with federal and state laws. And so as institutions underwent review or had reporting to us, obviously we were paying attention to those kinds of changes, and we were receiving questions from our institutions and trying to help them navigate what they needed to be doing. Going back to the standards, I do just want to use some specific examples from our standards that specifically look at some of what's been recommended already, policies and procedures around certain kinds of areas or other specific areas where evaluators are looking at our institutions, where we do have policies and procedures for academic and intellectual freedom, freedom of expression, intellectual property rights. We also have that education offers sufficient scope to draw students into new areas of intellectual experience. So some of the language that we have, and I have other examples as well, that is existing language or going to be some additional new pieces under our new standards, getting at, I think, the same kinds of topics that we're talking about here.
But I think specifically what I was asking, when the Supreme Court decision came out and it significantly changed the use of race in the admissions process, what did you do with regard to your standards, with regard to your policies, with regard to your processes? What changes did you make, and what was the sort of the time frame for that? Because it gives me a sense of, as we move through this process, what's a reasonable expectation when there are either legislative changes or monumental changes through case law?
You want to respond to that, and then I'll move on.
I think what is most helpful is the analysis that we do and the discussion that we have, not only internally, but also with our commission and as we position to talk with our institutions. So we host a whole bunch of trainings and webinars and other kinds of engagement strategies to help our institutions process what they need to be doing. So we didn't need to make a change because we have the requirement that institutions comply with state and federal law. And so we adopted a strategy to help them understand what those expectations were now under our admissions criteria, which is also within our standards. So we thread the needle through all of those different areas.
So you actually did not change the standards as a result?
We didn't need to change the standards because they already would have been supportive of the change.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jeff. Thank you, Heather. Jennifer, you have the floor.
Well, I was just going to say, just in my experience with other accreditors and accreditors generally, that kind of goes back to the whole point of the way the standards section is written, and why we want to keep it the way it is under laws, which is that it is already, most agencies are neutral in the conversation about accreditation. It's really about the process of review. And so it's not, to me, Jeff, the question, she just answered it, but it's not necessarily the question of did they have to change their standards, because the standards are written in a way that's neutral, actually. It's whether when they were doing their review, they took into account that there was a change in law as it relates to admission. So that's more of a practice and procedure piece. And I mean, I'll speak for just the frames of reference that I have, and the answer is that the agencies I know definitely were taking it into account when they were looking at schools.
Yeah, I mean, typically though, in sort of my experience in just general reviews, even from the department's perspective, if there's a significant change that occurs, one of the things that we do in the review is we look for a change in the policy of whoever we're reviewing, and also in the case of, and my question was not only the standards, it was standards, policies, and procedures.
Thank you, Jennifer. Thank you, Jeff. Mike?
I mean, I think the point that I'd like to make is how could the accrediting community have been consistent with the law if the court ruled that the practices by the institutions that they oversee was not legal? And in fact, some accreditors signed amicus briefs in support of the position that was ultimately overturned by the Supreme Court. And so on its face, we need to do something in the rule because the status quo was not working.
Thank you, Mike. AD, you have the floor.
Just a very brief potential change, if you'd be open to it, and we'll put in writing and send it to you. On page 85, when it talks about the agency may not have policies that require institutions or programs to violate any federal or state law, and later on it says that agencies may not have policies that require institutions or programs to provide preference, and keeps going, to just add a clarifying word, unlawful preference, so even though it may already be covered by the first sentence, but we got feedback from our constituency group and First Amendment attorneys that it would be helpful to have that clarity, because whether it's an all-girls school or other type of situations where there is discrimination on it, but it's lawful discrimination, we want to clarify, just in case anybody thinks otherwise, that agencies may not have policies means only unlawful preferences. And that's something we'll send you in writing if that's something the department's open to.
Yeah, that's a good catch. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeff. Thank you, AD. Brian, you have the floor.
I think, to AD's point, I don't know if the department would even look at this, but how do you envision that the accreditors would operationalize these expectations in a consistent and measurable way? Do you have any guidance with that or any suggestions?
I'm going to get back to you on that one, okay? Because I'm going to talk to you when Beth gets back on that, because I want to make sure that we're consistent with precedent and how we've operationalized other standards and other changes there. So if you wouldn't mind.
No, and I appreciate that, and it wasn't meant to be on the spot. It just kind of asked that question, for future approach.
I got you. Thank you.
Thank you, Brian. Thank you, Jeff. Jennifer, you have the floor.
Yeah, AD, thank you for mentioning the single-sex institutions, because actually earlier I meant to ask, Jeff, you mentioned HSIs, which I think it's statutory that they are determined by the percentage of Spanish speaking, or I forget what the definition is in the historically Spanish serving institutions, but in any event, it is by enrollment for those institutions. And so how does that square in not just with regard to accreditation, but just in general, how does this square with HSIs and their mission? I mean, they're not mission-based, it's literally statutory.
Correct. It's statutory, and there's a funding mechanism there. The administration's put out its positions with regard to with regard to HSIs on funding and its position. So I'm really not going to go probably further past that.
So they're not protected in terms of this provision. I mean, so the extent that you're amenable to excluding religious faith-based institutions, and HBCUs, you would not have something in here for HSIs?
Jake?
Yeah, so different levels of scrutiny. So religious institutions are going to, it's a First Amendment right. There's some pretty heavy case law on what you can and can't require of religious organizations. When we're talking about, you mentioned single-sex institutions, race and gender are also subject to different levels of scrutiny. So I just want to clarify that we are talking about 3 different levels of standards of what is allowable in terms of case law. And I know that does not help make things clearer at all. That makes the water a lot muddier. But yeah, I just wanted to table that.
Okay.
Brief follow-up?
Do I have I just had one other question, which is you have in here with regard to contractors, and there are state laws that encourage when you are, I think particularly for public institutions, but encourage when you're putting on an RFI, or that you have minority-based contractors or gender-based, focus on women-based businesses as contractors, especially in the public sector. And so I'm just curious how that squares in this section.
So which one are you specifically focused on? Because I think the references that we brought in contractors were not related to this. They were related to training and coverage of personnel.
It's on page 85. I can't remember what section overall that is, but it's H on page 85. And it says that agencies must not have policies that require institutions or programs. Now, I'm not saying that the agencies would have policies that require institutions, but I am curious about how the poor institution does handle a situation where they're told by their states, when you go out for an RFI, you need to entertain or potentially use small businesses or small businesses, women-based, owned businesses, minority-owned businesses. So this is not about the accrediting, because I don't think accreditors would ever require this, but I do think institutions do that, and they're sometimes required to do that under state law. So I just don't know how these square with that. So I would delete contractors. But
well, I think that you have to look at the stem of that on H, which says that the agency must not have policies that require institutions or programs to violate any federal or state law. So if the policy itself, if what you're talking about, because of the inclusion of contractors, if that would be a violation of state law, then that would not be covered.
Final thought here, and then I'm going to move to Siri for time.
Read the whole paragraph as a whole, because you go on to explain what you mean by violating federal state law, which might be part of the problem, because you say which means and then go on. So I think you have a structural issue. If that's what you mean, Jeff, then
yeah, the examples there are illustrative and not exclusive.
Then it needs editing because it says which means.
It says including.
Do we need to clear that up now before I move on to Siri? Okay, great. It is 4:01. Siri, you are the last card I am calling on today.
Thank you. I promise to be brief, but I want to conclude all the discussions that I heard today with an analogy that my co-author Mike Ryle and I had published last year. Stick with me on this, but universities are like super tankers. They have such enormous momentum, and changing direction requires sustained, coordinated effort over years. No individual captain, however reform-minded, can simply override the navigational rules that are imposed by external authorities. Accreditor standards shape the course of every institution that depends on federal student aid eligibility, regardless of what any board or president might prefer. And this problem is compounded by some accreditors' well-documented lag in incorporating changes in governing law, as Jennifer and I saw in Nisiki. And those accreditor standards developed through slow-moving consensus processes dominated by institutional insiders have been characteristically slow to reflect this binding legal change, for example, the Supreme Court, 2023. So institutions are left navigating between what the accreditor still signals as a preferred practice and what the federal law now prohibits, a position no reform-minded team can resolve. I think the proposed language corrects this. When the Maritime Authority fails to update its navigational charts, ships run aground. And the wreckage we're witnessing across American higher education, with small colleges, including today, closing at an accelerating rate. It's what happens when supertankers are steered by outdated maps into waters that the law has actually already declared off limits. Accreditors must update the charts. The workforce cannot afford to keep watching vessels sink.
Thank you all for a very productive day. Jeff, do you have anything you'd like to say in closing?
No, I appreciate everyone's candor, and I think this is a great debate, particularly around transfer of credit. I think that was probably the best discussion in a long time that I've seen on that topic, and so I think we're making good progress here.
Thank you all. Have a wonderful evening, and I will see you back here tomorrow morning.